Hello and welcome everyone to our webcast today on global consumer trends. I'm Denise Dahlhoff, Senior Researcher here at the Conference Board, and I'm focused on consumer research. I will be moderating this conversation today with our expert panel, and we'll be talking about the latest results from our global consumer survey, which we conduct every quarter. And so we'll be talking not just about consumer confidence in different parts of the world, but also what kinds of categories people are spending their money on, what they have cut back on to save money, and also what their concerns are. Of course, needless to say, this is a really interesting time in the world. There is so much going on which certainly should affect consumers. And that includes, the ongoing and persistent trade negotiations between the US and China, US and Europe, but also topics like Brexit and, certain domestic challenges in some economies, such as in Hong Kong, as well as in Spain with the Catalonia issue, but also we have recently heard from Ecuador. So lots of interesting questions, and we want to know, how is the global consumer doing? And I'm joined today by an expert panel, which I'm going to introduce to you. You'll see that we have both economic and marketing experts join us, because these questions about consumers have so many angles. So we want to hear both perspectives. And let me start introducing our first panelist. If you see this, sorry. You pull up the slide. The first panelist I want to introduce is Bart van Ark, the Conference Board's chief economist. And to kick off our conversation, I actually would like to ask each of the panelists to share with us one recent insight or an observation that they found particularly interesting, insightful, or maybe even intriguing, or in some way valuable to share with our audience. So welcome, Bart. Thank you so much for joining us. And may I ask you to kick us off?
Yeah, I have to kick you off. Thanks, Denise. Glad to be on. Well, as an economist on this call, what I'm struck by is that consumer confidence stays so high despite all the challenges that we have in the world around us, and actually unusually high. And I think a lot of that may have to do with the strength of the labor markets in many countries. And the big question, of course, is how long that's going to continue. But for the moment, the consumer is pulling us through, and that's a really interesting observation at this point.
Thank you so much. And so then now we are going around the world. I want to introduce Ilaria Marcelli, our colleague in Europe. She is the senior economist for Europe. Thank you so much for joining us, Ilaria. And can you also share from your perspective, what is one insight or observation that you find noteworthy about consumers?
Thank you, Denise, for inviting me, and hello, good morning, or good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. What I find amazing, and I don't know if it is a generational thing, because I'm also an economist, is the fact that the concern over global warming in some countries just keeps increasing, and it's now higher than the economy in some countries like France and Germany. So I'm amazed by that, and I wonder how down the road this will change the behavior of consumers.
Yeah, super interesting question, and we all have the images of all the climate protests in our heads. So it will be interesting to see how that is going to affect consumer behavior. And then our third panelist is Bill Hopkins. He's the global lead for shopper and customer insights at Molson Coors. He's also an advisory board member of our Consumer Dynamics Institute here at the Conference Board. Bill, to you as well, thank you so much for joining us. And
thank you.
Go ahead.
And thank you for having me. I echo what Bart said. It's remarkable how confidence numbers have stayed up so high around the globe despite all the geopolitical tensions, trade, and all those other things that you hear about in the constant drumbeat. One other thing I'd point out is where you do see isolated pockets of a big change, like Hong Kong and Peru and some other elements where you see a big delta between quarter to quarter, they don't seem to impact or have a big effect on the region or the greater area as much as we typically see in that scenario. But again, thank you for having me.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing. And then last but not least, here in studio, I'm joined by John Forsythe. He's the leader of our Consumer Dynamics Institute at the Conference Board. And he has a long history in consumer insights, including at McKinsey, where he led the consumer insights and analytics practice for many years. Thank you so much as well for joining us, John. And what's your insight that you want to share with us?
And thanks for having me here. Looking at the consumer insights, just to build on what Bill and Bart said, it's amazing that it stayed so high. And in particular, when you look at even some of those places like Hong Kong, or in a couple of places like in the US and Germany, where job prospects may be coming off a little bit, which we'll get into later, you still see the consumer spending doesn't change by all that much. And so in spite of all these situations, consumer spending and saying it's a good time to spend stays high.
Interesting. So let's get more into some of those questions as we continue the conversation. But first, let me give you a quick overview of what we'll be covering today. As I mentioned, these are all based on findings from our latest reading of our collection of data in our Global Consumer Confidence Survey. We'll be reviewing global and regional results from the third quarter. We will also be looking at the underlying drivers of consumer confidence, and those are job prospects, personal financial situation, and people's spending optimism. And then we'll look, how do people actually behave? What do they do with their money? What kinds of categories are they spending their money on? And if they have to save, where do they cut back? And then since we have Bill joining us today, we have a special topic this time, which is we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into alcoholic beverages and out-of-home entertainment and review the data that we have on these categories. And it will be great to get Bill's perspective on those categories. And then we'll finish with looking at consumers' various concerns ranging from economic to political and social ones. Doesn't move.
I show the CE credit page.
Oh, I didn't see that. Sorry, I don't see the... Anyway, just some housekeeping items. You can get credit for attending the live session. You just have to stay online and follow the prompts 3 times during our session. And also, we encourage audience questions throughout our conversation. So please chime in with your questions or comments. We would love to incorporate them. And you'll see we'll engage you in the conversation by posing some questions to you that we would like to get your thoughts on. So let's kick it off with looking at some research that Bart and his team have been doing. And they found something really interesting, and that is that CEOs and consumers have a very different view, apparently, of what's ahead in the economy. And may I ask you, Bart, to walk us through that a little bit and give us a little bit more insight?
Yeah, so just first of all, this slide is only referring to the United States. I mean, the rest of our webcast is global, but there's only for the United States that we really have monthly measures of consumer confidence, and then we have quarterly measures of business confidence. Those are both metrics we're doing at the Conference Board. And this really goes to the point that I mentioned earlier. The blue line here is the expectations part of the US Consumer Confidence Index. So this is looking at just the forward-looking part, what consumers think about the economy, what they think about business conditions, what they think about the income situation. And then the orange line is CEO confidence, which is really prospects of CEOs about what are your major outlook with regard to investments, with regard to growth in the economy, with regards to profitability. And as we mentioned earlier, I mean, you can see how large this gap has become over the last year or so. Consumer confidence, it's a lot more volatile than it used to be, but it stays at relatively high levels. You can see some real volatility beginning of this year with the government shutdown, but then it picked up again, and even last month we had a big slowdown, but it all still looks at this is at historically high levels. You know, CEOs obviously are worried about a lot of things that are happening around us, and this gap, frankly, going back, and this slide only goes back to 2006, but even if you go much further back, we rarely have seen it be so big. So something will have to give, and I think that really depends on what are the underlying reasons for this. A question about it to the audience, right? What could be the underlying reasons be, Denise?
Yes, let's ask the audience about this. So what could be reasons that have caused this big gap? And you'll see on your screens the 4 options. So the large gap between strong consumer confidence and weak CEO confidence is mainly caused by either business leaders are more forward-looking than consumers, or trade disputes hurt businesses more than consumers. Business leaders are concerned about rising wages, while consumers, of course, benefit from rising wages, or consumers have enjoyed fairly low price increases and inflation rates. So please share your thoughts. We'll leave the poll up for a little bit, but in the meantime, let me ask John, what's your take on that gap? Do you have any, or referring to the polling question, any reason that stands out to you?
Well, I think consumers and CEOs look at the world very differently, right? I think on the consumer side, they're looking at their current situation, maybe they're looking out 6 months to a year, they're not thinking really long term. And they certainly do it, as Bill mentioned, they're not reading the Wall Street Journal all the time, they're not looking at the economic news 24/7, and it's unclear what really filters to them. They're looking, they see the economy still growing, they have their job, the friends have all their jobs and everything, and the tariffs haven't really come back to really increase prices in a significant way. So things seem pretty rosy to them still.
So let's look at what our audience thinks. Let's close the poll. And we actually have a tie here between the first 2 options. Exactly what John just said, business leaders are more forward-looking than consumers. But a tie with that, trade disputes hurt businesses more than consumers. Apparently people are thinking that businesses, swallow more of the price increases. But let me also ask Bill, how does, Bart shared the CEO confidence from, a broader perspective. How does that look at your company? How do you look at the economy going forward, and especially consumer spending?
Well, I like a lot about what John and Bart said, but let's look at it a different way. It's an incredible time to be a consumer right now. If you think about, we just shared all the numbers about the global confidence numbers and how they stayed remarkably high. And if you add that with the types of choice and liquidity and convenience that's available in the marketplace right now, it's a great time from a consumer perspective. But if you think about the cost and the anxiety and the heartburn of delivering it, that maybe that's one of the causes of this paradox between business leaders and consumers. Is we talked about trade and tariff and all those things. If you talk about if this was just United States numbers, the impacts of aluminum costs and other commodity costs and all those other things. But if you also think about the cost of delivering and the increased competition from the disruption in retail and e-commerce, and it's much harder to reach their consumers both from a B2B and a B2C standpoint, I just wonder if part of the paradox is part of this great global consumer economy, very consumer-centric, is causing a lot of constraints for business leaders that are trying to adapt to all the disruption that leads to this great economy that we're having.
Very interesting. So you're saying, it's essentially also catering to consumers' ever-changing needs, and that takes up a lot of resources already. And on top of that, you have all this global uncertainty. Let me also ask Ilaria. We heard from Bart about U.S. CEO confidence. How does that look in Europe? What do European CEOs think?
Well, if I replicate the same chart for Europe, it doesn't look that different. The levels of confidence among consumers are, on average, lower in Europe. So in the US, we are at the 100, whereas in Europe, let's say, we are close to 90. So the levels are different, but this bifurcation between consumer confidence staying quite high and business confidence going low, and with this gap as wide as ever is definitely true for here as well. And I think that kind of makes sense in the world we live in, because the things that concern the CEOs, such as the trade disputes, do not necessarily concern consumers, because businesses are not passing this on the consumers yet. We will see if that happens later on, but so far inflation is at 1% on this side of the world. So consumers might watch and follow the debates on TV, but they don't see that in the supermarket, and that explains why the gap is so wide.
Okay, thanks for sharing. And,
Denise, may I add one short comment here, because I find these results very interesting. So I very much agree with those of you who are saying that, also on this poll, that trade disputes really are hurting business a lot more at this point than they do consumers. There's also a comment here in the question box about, and then also CEOs are much more focusing on the global environment around them, which I think is also very much true. Consumers are much more focused on their domestic or even their local situation. But I want to push back a little bit on those of you who say that, business leaders are more forward-looking than consumers. We actually find in our research that not to be quite the case. Consumers and business leaders are looking at different things. Business leaders are looking at, what does this mean for my bottom line? What does it mean for my revenue growth? What does it mean for my investment prospects? Consumers are looking at, what does it mean for my job? And what does it mean for my income? And I think what we're seeing right now, actually consumers are better in predicting a recession than businesses are when we just look at the numbers. And I think what we're just seeing right now, because the labor market is so strong in many countries, that consumers remain very positive. They just don't see that their job is being under threat, whereas businesses definitely see push on their revenue growth, they see push on their investment prospects and things like that. So that's, I think, where the bifurcation in these results is coming from.
And Bart, do you sort of see then the job concern might even be a leading indicator within the consumer, if something may go?
Yeah, so we'll talk about that in a minute, and this might be a good segue, actually, Denise, to discuss the results. But yeah, of the three underlying estimates, the three underlying sub-questions on the index, I actually believe that the job prospects are probably the most forward-looking part of what the consumer is focusing on.
Let's dive into the survey. John, do you want to give a really quick background on the survey, what we even ask, just so people know what we're talking about?
Sure, and I think a couple key things from this page, as we talked to 32,000 consumers over 64 markets in various countries all around the world. A key thing to remember in all this is an online survey in most every country. So we go into a country if it has 60% internet penetration or 10 million online users. So whenever you see a country, it's the online population within that country. In many cases, that's the key ones to look at, but that's what we do. 500 per market, weighted. The only in China, we also do some in-person interviews because of the importance of the Chinese economy to the global economy. And as I think you've heard, what we ask is on a 4-point scale, 3 key questions. What do you think about job prospects in your area over the next 12 months? Your own personal finances, how that's going to happen, change over the next 12 months? And is this a good time to buy goods and services? And those are the 3 key questions that make up the overall confidence. We also have some other topics which we'll get into later on what you're spending on and what's of concern to you.
Thank you so much. By the way, I don't know whether the audience hears, we're in the middle of a fire alarm here. So, or fire drill,
It's a drill. They've told us it's a drill.
We're safe, but we apologize for any noise that you might hear. So let's look at some high-level results from our latest reading. So in Q3, so overall we see still really high confidence. It has held very steady or even improved in some of the regions that we are looking at. It has improved in Europe and Latin America. It has otherwise been fairly stable. It has softened a little bit in North America, but again, it's still very high. We also see that large economies such as the US, China, India, as well as Germany remain at high confidence levels. Of course, while at the regional aggregate level and the global level, we don't see so many changes. There's a lot going on underneath. And I want to ask Bart to walk us through some of the changes that we have seen at a global level.
Yeah, so the next slide that we'll just go one backward, I think is at the same time. The next two slides are really going to look at the changes over time. This slide is just looking at the change year over year. And again, this is a heat map. So red basically means that things are going down, and green means that things are going up. So if you look at this over a year ago, Q3 this year over Q3 2018, you find that actually the most advanced parts of the world, which is Europe, North America, and sort of Asia Pacific, and particularly here Australia and so on, actually have been beginning to see some decline. So you know, it's coming from very high levels, as Denise just showed in the previous chart. So nothing to be really worried about, but it's leveling off a little bit. And again, for the US, we also see that in our own consumer confidence index, it's not going up further, it's moving sideways, it's becoming more volatile. And that's what we're seeing in those numbers. Emerging markets on the whole have still been doing okay. In China, for example, despite a lot of pressure on the consumer confidence is still up 2 points in China compared to a year ago. Now, if we look at this chart, which is quarter over quarter, so now we're not looking a year back, but now we're looking at the change in Q3 compared to Q2 in 2019, numbers are changing a little bit now, right? So you now begin to see that China actually is just 1 point down. So there's a little bit of leveling off in the case of China. You see India coming 3 points down. These are all, again, not big changes, but they do show that there's a little bit more pressure there on some of those economies as well. And then notably, there are some big exceptions here. You know, you see, for example, Chile right there, Peru, are two countries that actually show fairly large declines. Also, you can see in this chart, but Hong Kong has been showing a very big decline in this past quarter. It actually came down by 14 points. That's a big deal, of course. And then also we have some upsides, also in the case of Europe, that Ilaria will talk about in a minute. So overall, I would say it is definitely a little bit of a leveling off compared to a year ago, but still at extraordinarily high levels, as you mentioned.
Right,
before.
that's a good segue to Ilaria. Yeah.
Oh, there's one thing I want to add. Just one quick thing I want to add, because that's in the title here. Having said all that, we do see slightly more number of markets actually moving into negative territory, right? So we had 29 of the 64 markets that were turning negative in Q2, now up to 33. So again, a little bit more movement in the sideways or slightly negative direction.
Great. After the tour around the world, let's go to Europe, to Ilaria, to look at some of the changes in Europe. Can you give us some highlights on Europe, Ilaria?
Right. Do you want me to go one by one? No, I'm joking. No, I pointed out some notable increases and notable decreases. But on average, consumer confidence went a little bit up, +1 for the Europe region, which is a very big region. It includes Russia. So if you look at the euro area, it's actually constant. And as we said before, it's still, although on average Europeans are less confident, but it's on a very high level historically. Now, going to specific countries, there is some I wanted to point out to you because these are interesting. So you see big drop in confidence in Ireland, Netherlands, and Spain. Now, in Ireland, I think there is an easy explanation. It's called Brexit. No one wants to talk about this anymore in Brussels. If you ask the Brexit question, the face you get is like, oh, again. But looking at Ireland, it's interesting to see how this is affecting consumers as well. And I think this is also an explanation, at least partially, for what is happening in the Netherlands, where also we observe a remarkable decrease in confidence. I think it's -7 compared to the previous quarter. And the Netherlands is the second economy that is most exposed to the Brexit shock after Ireland, of course. Then there was Spain, and Spain is also a case worth talking about. There is, on the one hand, consumer confidence going down. On the other hand, there is an increasing concern about political stability. So the country will go to elections again. That's the second election this year. And so people are stressed by the fact that there is no government in sight in the short term either. And which means that no room for reforms at a time where the economy has been slowing down. So these are the three notable decreases. There are a couple of notable increases. One is Italy. I think it's interesting because the country, the economy keeps stagnating since basically 2 decades, and any help to push the economy up is, of course, welcome. It's a big country, big economy in the Eurozone. And I think this increase for Italy is due to the fact that the government fell in summer, but then quickly a new government was put out, and the main mission of the government was not to avoid an increase in VAT that would have been automatic in 2020. And this the message arrived quite clearly to consumer, and I think I would explain this way the increase in confidence. And I think it's important also to mention Germany. I was a bit stressed in quarter two because we saw the consumer confidence going down in Germany, and we know already business confidence has been dropping down very fast since the end of 2017. So this small increase in Q3 is worth talking about because it relates again to this gap between consumers and producers, but it's an important signal that the domestic demand is there to support the economy, and Germany is the biggest country in the Eurozone. So if Germany catches a cold, if Germany sneezes, Europe catches a cold. So this is why.
Well, that's great, and now that it's recovering, maybe that's contagious as well. Let's hope. Let me also ask Bill and John from a marketing perspective. You know, we have heard the economic perspective. But what can this kind of information, when you see consumer confidence going up or down, how can that inform marketing strategies? How is that helpful? Do you want to kick it off, John, maybe?
Sure, okay. I think there are a couple of things that people look at, and you know, in particular because there's so much volatility, right, that companies need to then, you know, they can't think about long-term planning in this because who knows where we're going to be in 2 to 3 years. But what they can do, though, is look at annual plans, and particularly their marketing plans. You know, many companies, you know, have looked at, I'm sure have looked at different scenarios given what's going to happen to consumer spending in their marketplaces, right? And which is obviously, as we'll get into in a second, related to what the overall confidence index is. So the notion, one, I think they'll take really good news from this is, yes, we have the Chiles, we have the Hong Kongs, but then we also have the Germanys, right? And the overall continues to be, you know, good news on the confidence, and I think that'll be encouraging to them to make sure that they're that consumers will be still buying their products, and they should be continuing to invest in marketing to keep their brand strengthened, to keep growing. And so I think this will be encouraging to them. Yeah, they may want to look at Ireland, they may want to look at the Netherlands, you know, and pause for a second and maybe look at some of their scenarios and their annual plans, which may be not quite as optimistic. But I think for now, they will take this as really positive news.
What's your view, Bill? And do you use information like this for your planning? John mentioned that for annual planning. Would this be helpful for your plans?
Yeah, from a marketing and sales perspective, it's really hard to adjust to short-term volatility that you see in these consumer confidence numbers. Really what you're not looking at is the absolute numbers so much as the big deltas or the disruptions out there. And that makes it a little easier to manage the business when you're looking for those changes that we're seeing in the marketplace. And right now, some of the isolated pockets where you're seeing a negative or a positive change hasn't really had a big influence on the greater regional area. One thing I would add that from a marketing perspective is you want to speak to your consumers and your guests in the context of what their life is right now and show a degree of empathy to that. So to the sense that you know or have a pulse on what those consumers are feeling and seeing out there in the marketplace, you want to make sure you're speaking to them and talking to them with something that's relevant to how they're feeling right now about themselves, about their economy, about their region.
So building that emotional connection to consumers, using that information even just for messaging.
Can I ask Bill a quick question on this, Denise? So I would agree with you that I think the delta, the change is more important than the actual level, but to your last comment, there are these large differences in levels, and some of them really are a reflection of economic, but some of them are more a cultural reflection of whether there's just a positive mood, whether consumers are upbeat, like in India, for example, or tend to be generally more downbeat. So doesn't the level also matter for you? You know, how do consumers respond emotionally to changes?
Yeah, so yes and No. Yes, I agree the absolute level does matter, but when it's taken to text, because culturally you see that there's some culturally biased numbers out there. It tends to be, people tend to overstate their differences depending on the culture. So the absolute level matters. I just want to make sure I contextualize and make sure that's consistent with the baseline for what that society or that culture is showing.
Okay. So let's look now at, now that we have seen, the levels of consumer confidence, let's look at the drivers, the three components that we went over earlier. And let's do another poll question, and that is, so we're seeing these very high levels of consumer confidence currently. And what do you think are they mostly reflective of people's favorite perception of labor market conditions, people's personal finances, or that they think this is a good time to spend considering current prices and personal finances? Let me ask you again, Bill, like from looking at these three components from a marketing perspective, is there one of the three that you would look more at, or are they all equally important if you had your choice? How do you look at them?
I would love to be able to model all these against some sort of dependent variable that's relevant to your business to see really what's impacting. I assume that they're somewhat correlated together. When I look at the first two, your personal job situation or your personal financial situation, those seem to have a more of an acute impact on how you're feeling right now, and those might impact shorter term industries like consumer packaged goods and things like that. If I was in a business with perhaps a longer purchase cycle or more discretionary, say automobile, the third question, and remember these are just questions, as John pointed out, it's a survey we ask of consumers around the world, so their answers are basically an articulation of how they're feeling right now. With that being said, I think the last question tends to have a more holistic look at that and say I was in a longer purchase cycle or in the market for a car or something like that. That might be one of the questions I would look at that would encapsulate not just my personal job situation or personal financial situation, but more so my outlook overall as to what the economic conditions are out there and my confidence in making a big CapEx spend.
Okay, let's close the poll. And we see here that labor market conditions actually come out first. And second is actually what the component that Bill mentioned at last, this being a good time to spend, and third is people's personal finances. But let's look at this a little bit more in depth also to see how these components have evolved. And so we have three slides now that show more detail on each of these components. And Bart, do you want to kick us off on the job outlook question and how that has developed in certain regions and markets?
Sure. Quickly refer back to the poll and also to Bill's comments, because obviously as an economist, this job prospects thing, as I mentioned earlier, I think is the most leading part. So it helps us to understand what's going to happen next. But I think Bill made some really interesting comments, because it seems to me it depends a little bit on which kind of consumer business you're in, what you care most about, right? I mean, if you have fast-moving goods, then, obviously whether this is a good time to spend is the most important thing. However, if you are sort of more in sort of material kind of longer-term investments that consumers make, like housing and so on, it's much more the personal finance situation. And then, things like retail and particular restaurants and hotels and so on may be more dependent on job market prospects. So I think it's very important for each individual business to really think about what is the factor that impacts us most and focus a little bit on that and think about the dependent variables. So thank you for that comment, Bill, because I do think it really matters what kind of business you're in, where you're going to focus on. So going on the first question, which is the job prospects. So what you're seeing here is that there we see, globally a slight weakening. I mentioned it before. It's not a big deal, but for example, in the case of the United States, which is the blue line, you can actually see that coming down a little bit. So, we've had this continuous additions to employment and job growth in the United States, but it has gradually come down a little bit. And I think consumers are beginning to see that probably the really rapid growth is gone. It's not a big concern yet, but I'm definitely sensing that right. I think Asia Pacific is staying very high on this chart. and no major movements in that respect. China is actually the top line, and so it's looking a little bit better at it now, staying at a very high level also. And then sort of at the lower end, you see some improvement in some of the emerging markets. Related to my earlier comment that the emerging markets are actually still hanging in okay there. Latin America picking up a little bit. The UK is shown in this chart. Again, that has come down a lot, that purple line, but has begun to pick up a little. Now, again, it's overall coming from pretty high levels. Unemployment rates are quite low. Consumers overall think that I see wage increases happening most of the time. But it is definitely a first signal that the times of it going up and up over time have gone. And therefore, we need to continue to watch this very carefully.
And just to clarify what you see here, these are balances between optimistic outlook and pessimistic outlook. So you see the zero line there in the middle. So everything, you see essentially the balance between, optimistic and pessimistic prospects. So let's.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that. So all the lines that are below zero just means there are more pessimistic views than optimistic views in that economy.
So let's move to the next component, which is personal finances. And by the way, we got a comment from William Ryan, who says, can we even separate both the labor market conditions from people's personal finances, whether there might be a connection between the two. So let's move into personal finances, speaking of that component. Ilaria, do you want to walk us through some of the changes?
Right, I'm happy to do that, and also I'm happy to take the comments, because I look, of course, in bigger details at the European numbers, and I think it makes sense to separate them, because you have, on the one hand, the labor market, and the labor market is surprisingly continuing here to add jobs. So the unemployment rate keeps going down, 0.1 something at a time, but it keeps going down. But at the same time, what you see in the labor market is that wages are increasing. And on average, in the euro area, we are in the range of 2.5%. And at the same time, inflation, as I was saying before, is very low. We are in the range of 1%. So this means that more people are finding a job, more people are employed. At the same time, these people are earning more. And so the purchasing power of households is growing as a result of the two components. So I think that's why it's very subtle. But I think it still makes sense to look at the two components, to reply to the comment. Now, going to the chart here. Overall, you can see there is no major volatility on this part. I think the only two lines that are more clearly moving down, one is Latin America, and the other one is the UK. So the UK, there was a small improvement this quarter, but it's coming down from a rather consistent decrease. That partially, I think, has to do with the volatility of the pound, because the volatility of the pound makes the devaluation of the pound makes imports more expensive, and in the UK they import a lot of goods while they export a lot of services. So this might have an impact on consumers and the perception of prices from consumers. Whereas in the other countries, Euro area, US trending up, the other ones more or less stable. I would not point at one quarter going up or down, because, as was said before, the trends are more important here than the quarter-on-quarter change.
Okay, great. And let's do the third component. Spending optimism. John, may I ask you to highlight some of the interesting things you saw?
Sure, right. And this is, we ask, how good a time is it to buy needed or wanted goods and services? Some comments on the level that you have, two countries and, quite frankly, regions that are optimistic, the U.S. and China. So they're on the blue and the orange line, up pretty high. And then, for a moment, if we ignore the UK, the Euro, Latin America, and Africa and Middle East are more on the pessimistic side, low. I think that's somewhat a reflection of how they feel. But I also think, Bill, to your point, there's a lot of cultural differences here, right? And we see this, many other kinds of research we do, that the U.S. and many parts of Asia can be very optimistic. Not every country, but a lot of that. So yeah, the trends I think are interesting. And here, like with the others, we don't see much volatility. things for most of these areas are at or near historical highs in the time to spend. So that's reflecting of consumers still think it's a good time. The U.S. is down a little bit. I think it's interesting. It's down a little bit. It's not quite as down as much as jobs. So maybe they're a little worried about jobs, but it hasn't quite kind of moved over to they're worried about spending. Something obviously we'll want to take a look at. But for the most part, the UK's up. China looks good. The Euro's even up at an all-time high in spite of maybe some of the pessimism. So I think this continues to show strength in how consumers view this time as a time to spend.
Mm-hmm. And maybe back to Ilaria's comment when she mentioned, the purchasing power is high, inflation rates are low. So that might help this as well. And to answer the polling question, what actually has helped consumer confidence the most, if you look at these three components and look where the most optimistic portions are, that's actually personal finance. And going back to that comment, whether personal finance and job prospects are actually sort of measuring the same or somehow connected, we definitely see distinct differences. So that also indicates that they are apparently measuring something differently. There was another comment about that by Elizabeth Ayres. So let's switch gears a little bit. So we get to some of we have talked a lot about, how people feel economically, but let's also look at how they behave, what they spend their money on. It's like one of the questions we ask. We specifically ask, like, what do you do with your extra cash? What kinds of categories do you spend it on? And here you see on this slide, you see some select categories. And we highlight in the bottom part, we highlight some of the ones that had either that had notable movements, either in a positive or negative direction. Let's first see what contracted. And the most notable one there is holidays, vacations, in some of the regions, the Euro area, Africa, Middle East, that can also be seasonal, as well as new clothes. And that's a little bit more pervasive around the globe. On the positive side, though, we have seen upward movements in out-of-home entertainment. Bill will like to hear that. in various regions, North America, Asia Pacific, Euro area, little softening in Latin America, but also new technology products have seen an improvement again after the last quarter where it was a little down. And also, interestingly, people invest more in stocks and mutual funds, which, you might argue it could underline people's confidence that they actually have some faith in the market still and invest their money there. It might also be in some regions, in particular, a reflection of lower interest rate. But let me, since we have Bill here and want to look a little bit more at his category and adjacent categories. Let's look more at out-of-home entertainment. You see the developments here in the various regions, and that actually looks recently pretty good. There was some apparently like earlier this year, late last year, there was some downward movement in Asia Pacific as well as in Latin America, but that seems to be recovering. What do you think about these the graphs, Bill? Is this consistent with what you have been seeing in your market?
Yeah, let me just take a step back. And when I look at share of clock and share of spend overall, the amount of spend in absolute terms that people spend on entertainment or whatever has been remarkably consistent over time. And if you look at a number of different studies that show that corroborate that, if you look at the share of time they spend on entertainment, it's been remarkably consistent over time. Now, if you look at out-of-home entertainment in the context of what's happened recently, it might seem surprising to some because think, all of a sudden I have remarkable amounts of digital socialization at my fingertips. I can stay connected to whoever I want without having to go anywhere. I have a remarkable amount of e-commerce or delivery or other options here that might be like signing the death knell of, say, out of home. But it's actually quite the opposite. If you look at the generational elements, millennials and Gen Z, kind of this mixed bag of idealism and pragmatism, but one of the things that he and she likes to enjoy most is these experiential elements of getting out and doing things and experiencing the world and things like that. So I think one thing you're seeing here is the paradox there that I mentioned is this a generational element of wanting to go out and see life and experience things and in great environments.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, there has been a bigger shift, I think, in general, you know, toward experiences, and maybe even, you know, there has been a contagion effect to other generations as well. Okay, so lots of innovation apparently going on in that space. Let's skip this audience questions and let's look at, you know, the sort of the opposite of, you know, spending. What kinds of initiatives are consumers taking when they want to save? So here we see the top 10 that we have been seeing. So you see at the top, new clothes, out-of-home entertainment, gas and electricity and takeaway meals are the top 4, and cheaper grocery brands, top 5. Those are like items of daily, you know, daily use or daily, the little indulgences of daily life probably. Is there anything that surprises you, like to see like gas and electricity, which seems to be like such a basic, you know, need, to see that there? Does anybody want to comment on that? Does anything strike you about this, about the savings categories that people are the initiatives that they take?
Yeah, and gas and electricity, maybe it's saying it's easy to turn down the thermostat, you know, and it's something I can do, you know, pretty fast, and it doesn't say I've turned it down 10 degrees, but you know, it just may just be a little bit.
You have taken action.
It's taking some kind of action. Yeah, that's one thing. The other thing I find interesting is we go back to the other one on vacations. You know, it's holidays and short breaks come up as number 6. My annual vacation, though, is another part we ask here, doesn't show up on the top 10 list at all. So people say, oh, look, I'll save on that weekend away, but my annual vacation to the beach, no, I'm still going to take that.
Laura, you were going to say something.
Yes, no, I was looking at the big European countries, because of course when you look at the very aggregate numbers, it's difficult to make sense. And I found a few interesting things, and one, for example, was UK big cut down on takeaway meals. And that makes sense because consumers have confidence has been going down for a long time, all the things we said before, so that makes perfect sense. It's something extra perhaps. But then some other things signal more a change in behavior, and one of them is smoking. Trend going down. If you look at all countries, whether there is high consumer confidence, low consumer confidence, you see shutdown on smoking as one of the measures. And then there was another one, again related to change in behavior, and that was the question, like if the economy improves, I will still use my car less. And that was very high. I noticed really that for France and Germany, which, as I said before, is one of the there are countries where the concern over global warming is going up every quarter, like almost doubling.
So you're seeing some essentially structural changes or more long-term changes in consumer behavior. And just to add on to what John said earlier, you know, that vacations and holidays, that's pretty much not on the cutting block. And going back to Bill's category, the same we actually see for alcoholic beverages. That's also not among the top 10. And we also don't see a lot of movement there. I mean, it's a slight uptick recently in North America, the blue line there. And again, to get your view on this slide, Bill, does this look consistent with your experience? And is there anything, you know, you can comment on North America specifically, why, you know, there might be a slight uptick, or is that an outlier?
Yeah, this topic's a little tricky because there's been some short-term abstinence programs out there. You might have heard of like Dry January and things like that. That might cause some volatility in the data from period to period, particularly I think in North America, UK, a couple other places where that's prevalent. But I think that has a masking effect towards a broader change in people's behaviors. You're seeing a lot more evolution around the products, whether it be lower alc or no alc, or adding different sorts of flavor profiles or lower carbs or lower calories or adding additional benefits like, say, superfoods and things like that. So I think the pace of innovation around alcohol and alcohol spending is really developing around that. It's probably impacting some markets more so than others from a leading perspective, but I suspect it will come in different pockets elsewhere. But overall, from a spending perspective, we've seen stability here, but we have seen a pretty big shift in consumers' palates as well as taste and things. And I think the market, and the big manufacturers and the small manufacturers are all evolving around that to make sure they're catering to those consumer changes in taste.
So again, yeah.
So Denise, one or two quick comments here. One question was online, what explains the little peak that we see in Q4 of 2018? And that's an interesting question. The reason why I think that happened, that some categories suddenly moved up, is because late 2018 was when the stock markets really were in pretty rapid decline. And at that time, recession concern was actually a really, really big deal, bigger than it is today, actually. So at that point, you see that consumers are actually making short-term responses. And that gets me to Ilaria's point, because she makes a good point about sort of structural changes and short-term changes. And this is really a mix, right? Because some of these reactions are short-term reactions that now it happens, you're suddenly going to change your preference set. But then underlying, there is changes like global warming, and maybe we should use our car less when times don't get all that good. So there's a lot behind here that we need to figure out, I think, in going forward. Last comment I wanted to make, and maybe that's a question back to Bill, is of course the trade-off between out-of-home entertainment and in-home entertainment. And that's a big trade-off. When the economy gets bad, people go do more in-home entertainment. We have always seen that trade-off. And that, I think, in that sense, your business, Bill, could actually be a leading indicator. If you see that people are consuming more at home rather than out in bars and restaurants, that would be an indication that there is a greater concern in the economy. And I think what you're telling me is that you're not seeing that right now.
Yeah, not a lot to build there. I agree with you. And I don't usually want to draw swords with an economist, but there is one. I always heard, anecdotally, I always heard there was one industry that was recession-proof, and that was film, because it provided an escape, and that's technically out-of-home entertainment. So I don't have any statistics. That's just anecdotal, but there always is escapes from what's happening around you, and sometimes out-of-home entertainment provides that.
So
cinema really has entered the living room now, I think. So that might be another structural change.
So we might want to think of some index, the entertainment index to see what's going on in the economy. So given that we are running out of time, I want to skip to one specific slide. We're also tracking people's concerns, as I mentioned, and they range from economic concerns to political ones, to social ones, personal ones. And one really stunning trend that we have seen over the last several quarters across the world, in fact, is that the biggest concern, the question about biggest concern, global warming, has consistently gone up. You see that on this slide, and again, it's across the world. Even in North America, it's like the highest number. And that coincides, with all the climate protests, and people seem to be really into sustainability these days. They are looking to companies to offer sustainable products. The question that I'm wondering about, consumers are often passionate about something, and they might indicate an interest in something, but sustainability initiatives, of course, are also costly. So companies have to share those costs in some way. So sustainable products are mostly a little bit more expensive. My question is, does this passion for, wanting to save the environment, to help with consumption behavior, does that actually translate into consumer behavior, including willingness to pay higher prices for that? And let me first ask the two marketers. John, do you want to?
Sure. Well, yeah.
Comment on that?
And particularly with sustainability and the environment, it's a big step to go from concern to actual paying higher prices for different goods and services. We've seen attitudes toward environmental have been positive for a while, and it hasn't translated into that. But that said, I think even though these are low numbers, to say this is your biggest concern, I think is a big deal. And sometimes we see these trends that have been around for a while all of a sudden hit an inflection point and change quickly. Now maybe that's not reflected, I'm going to spend a lot of money for sustainability in some of these things, but I think we've seen some of that already in terms of the locavore movements in many countries where people are buying local produce, so it doesn't have to be shipped everywhere. No plastic bags, different places. People are recycling more than ever. So there's a lot of behavior that's starting to show that people are serious about the sustainability. And whether that'll translate to spending a lot more on every product and services, I think that'll depend on the category.
Bill, any thoughts from your side?
Just a couple quick builds, because I agree with everything John said, but consumers are making choices where they're starting relationships with the companies they transact with. It's becoming deeper, and they're looking more and more into it. And I think consumers want that authenticity or that realism with the company they're doing business with. So regardless of the social elements that we talked about before, I think companies have always kind of done and said the right things, but are they beginning to support it with their behaviors and things like that? So I think that's an important thing as we see these leading indicators probably develop more, as that these consumers are going to develop deeper relationships with the companies they work with, and those companies are going to have to back it up with real things rather than just say lip service to what they think the consumers want to hear.
And maybe this emotional connection will, then drive up willingness to pay and, the willingness to stay with that company. From an economic perspective, how do you look at the sustainability topic? Because that's clearly a big consumer trend. There is innovation required from companies. There is a lot of cost involved. Bart or Ilaria, do you have any thoughts on that?
Let Ilaria start. She's coming in.
Right. No, but before I answer your question, Denise, I'm gonna point at a few more numbers, because I think this is definitely one question where it makes sense to look at the results country by country, because here we still stay below 10%, but again, I was looking at European numbers, and in countries like France and Germany, we are in the range of 14, 15, and this concern is bigger than the traditional top concerns like health or the economy. So just to give a size of how important this is right now in some places. I think this will translate into action, and I think one piece of evidence we got in the C-Suite Challenge survey of last year, where we asked CEOs, do you expect consumers to be willing to pay a higher price for sustainably produced goods? And almost half of them, I think it was 46% of them, replied globally. I'm talking about global results. 46% of them replied yes, and so they expect that people will pay more. They will attach a higher value to this, and therefore they will be willing to pay more.
Great. Well, thank you so much for all your input. We're at the top of the hour. Obviously, we could talk much more about this. Thank you to all panelists for participating. Thank you to the audience. And of course, also thank you to our digital team. Before you sign off, we just wanted to point out some resources that we have on our Global Consumer Confidence Index. This is the link to our website. Our main report will be published on November 5, and our Q4 release will be on January 8th. And we also have some upcoming webcasts. They are listed here. And we look forward to seeing you on a future webcast. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to the panelists again, and thanks to our digital media team.